In this video, we're going to look at the basics of masks in exposure blending. This assumes that you already know what masking is and what masks are. If you don't know what masks are and masking is, then you're probably a beginner to Photoshop, which means it's almost impossible for you to go from a beginner in Photoshop to advanced exposure blending in just a few hours. There's just too much for you to learn. So if you don't know what masking is and you're still new to Photoshop, I suggest you stop this video here and start doing some research on YouTube, on Google, just to get yourself better acquainted with Photoshop and masking. Then when you're comfortable with those concepts, come back to this, because this, of course, is an exposure blending course rather than a beginner's Photoshop course. So if you're comfortable with masking, let's move on. Here we have two images, one with hello in blue and one with hello in red. Now I just want to demonstrate a couple of things here. If I choose this rectangular marquee tool and just select the top half of the blue image, and then I click on the add a mask icon down here, you'll see we bring through the bottom half of the red hello. And that's because on the blue hello at the top, we have a white mask. So when we have a mask on a layer and that mask is white, that means that layer is visible. Since the top half of this mask is white, then the top half of this image is visible. And to view a mask, as I mentioned in the last video, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and left click on the mask. Now, since the bottom part of this mask is black, that means this layer in that area is invisible. So it shows the layer underneath, and the layer underneath is the red hello. So why am I showing you this? Well, if you look at the transition here between the red and blue hellos, it's a really strong, harsh transition. And that happens because if I delete this mask and create a new white mask, and I choose a paintbrush and a black brush, and I make sure that my hardness is set to 100%, and I'm going to choose a smaller brush here, and I just paint along here, again, look at how harsh the transition is between the red and blue hello. It's a very strong transition between these two colors. Now, if we go to a real-world example, so I'm going to choose this image here, which we saw earlier, and I'm going to go to the quick selection tool. And I'm going to make a selection of the sky. And I'm going to apply it to this darker exposure. So I can just create a mask, make it visible. And now look at how unnatural that blend looks. Look at the transition in the background here. We have these strong lines going right across the top of the canyons. It looks very unnatural. So if we look at the mask, we can see that the mask is strong too. There's just too much contrast in this mask for that blend to be natural. And again, if we look over here, that looks terrible too. Let's go back to our hello example. If I delete this mask again, create a new mask on there, select my brush. Let's choose a bigger brush here. And I'm going to bring the hardness down to 0. Now watch what happens when I paint black on this mask. I bring through the red hello, but in a really smooth, soft way. And if we look at the mask, we can see that, yes, we've got a lot of black down here. So where it's black, we're going to see most of the red hello. However, if we zoom in, we also have a transition from black to dark gray, and then eventually to light gray, and then to white. And because we've got that smooth transition, that's why we have the smooth transition here. So if I chose an even bigger brush, let me make this mask white again. And I go to my brush and make it really big. Let's say 1400 pixels. And again, I'm going to paint like this across here. There'll now be an even bigger transition between the dark and the white areas. So you see, we now have the black just as we did before, but the transition here is larger. We have a stronger transition, going from black to dark gray to eventually light gray and then white. And this, believe it or not, this simple function is what makes exposure blending so powerful, this smooth transition. It stops us from having these really harsh edges. So when we look at this mask again, as we saw before, we've got a lot of contrast. But if we were to make a mask with less contrast, then the blend would be much smoother. So let's remember, whatever's white on this mask will make this layer visible. Whatever's black, so the bottom part of the mask, will make this layer invisible in that area. But whatever's dark grey will still bring through that red layer, just not as strongly as the black areas. The lighter the grey, the more we see of this top layer. So another example of that, if we just create another white mask, now I choose my paintbrush again, but this time I'm going to choose a grey, and I'm going to paint over the whole image. And now we come out with kind of a violet, pink, purple color, because it's a blend of the blue and the red hello. So the mask has only partially made the blue hello invisible, and by doing that has partially brought through the red hello. So when we exposure blend, that's what we want to do also. So for this darker exposure, we want to bring through most of the sky. So we want the sky in the mask to be white, just like we have already in this mask. But we also want to partially bring through some of this horizon on the mask as well. So that means we need the horizon to be either a dark grey or a medium grey or even a light grey. Anything which is not as contrasting as the current selection. So if I open up Instamask and I create, say, a Brights 1, you can see that the background has close to a 50% grey tone. So this means some of the darker exposure will come through in that area and some of the brighter exposure will as well. And that should create a relatively smooth transition. But because some of these areas are also grey, then that means these will be affected by the darker exposure. So let me show you what I mean. I'm just going to press apply, and there you go. Now, if we look at the horizon, it's much more natural than the previous blend. But of course, we are affecting the foreground. So that's where it's better to use luminosity masks, so we can just paint in this area. Now we can also probably make a more contrasting mask than the one we just created. So if I choose a Brights 1 again, there's nothing wrong with making the mask a little bit more contrasting. We don't want it to be harsh like that, or we don't want to bring the highlights down and make them really white, because that's just going to create too strong of a transition between those two exposures. Instead, we just want to bring down the highlights, and by default the midtones will get darker, and you see we're just darkening the foreground too. And now I can press select, choose a black mask. I can show that layer, hide any marching ants, make sure I have a white brush because I have a black mask selected, make it a large brush, and then I'm just going to paint over the sky. Now naturally we talked about these exposures earlier and said that the sky or this exposure was too dark for the base exposure, so our suggestion was to bring down the opacity of that exposure to make it look more natural. So the final blend, if we zoom into the horizon, is a really natural transition between those exposures. It looks smooth and clean. So there is the before and after. And this is what the mask looks like. You see we've got a transition here between these exposures. So that's why we have a blend that doesn't look harsh. And that's the beauty of luminosity masking. Because we're building a mask around the brightness of our image, we will naturally come out with those nice gradients. Of course, we have to manage them a little bit and play with the mask to come out with the best possible mask. And there are other things that we can do to ensure that we have a really well blended image, which you'll see later on in the course. But the main thing is that we have a big enough difference between the sky and the foreground so that the sky is selected and the foreground isn't, but that difference isn't too strong. If there are some areas that we really don't want to be affected, then that's fine. We can make them dark grey or black, like these areas down here. But essentially, we want to make the areas that are involved in the transition between the sky and the foreground just a little bit lighter. We don't want them to be too harsh. And then when it comes to blending the image, it should become a very natural blend, just like this one. But while it's important not to create too contrasting a mask, it is still important to create enough contrast between the areas we want to select and the areas we don't want to select. Otherwise, we end up, just as we saw in the last video, with an image that just won't work. So let's say we want to select the sky to bring back the sky from the darker exposure, and we press Brights 1. No matter what we do with these sliders, we're not going to create a white sky. to separate it from the foreground. That's because there's just no difference in contrast between the sky and the foreground. It just isn't possible, and we don't need to do it. So one of the secrets to good blending is to make the areas you want to be selected nice and white, the areas you really don't want to be selected as black, but to find those transition points like this and make sure they're not too dark. Now, an easy way to think about that is simply by creating your mask. If you're not exactly sure about that, we can simply test our mask. So let's say we have this general mask, and we click on our exposure here, then we can press test, and we can make that exposure visible. And if it works, then we can use that mask. If not, we can press end test, and we can refine our mask a little bit more. And then we can try it again. We can press test, and if that worked, we can simply press apply. So that's a very basic introduction to how we can generate masks that will help us to smoothly transition between areas. Next, we're going to look at the steps involved in using Instamask when it comes to exposure blending. But in the video after that, we're going to talk about how to generate masks on certain exposures. So why I make certain exposures invisible or visible. And that takes us to a slightly more advanced phase of exposure blending.